Okay, back again here. Just finished up with the pre-Columbian Americas, and the Africa is just at the age of discovery and beyond. At this point, I'm going to double back a little bit and go back to the driving force of all of this change, and really the rise of European political and economic supremacy. And during the Renaissance, at the start of the Renaissance, the only really prosperous places in Europe were the city-states of Italy. They gained tremendously from the increased trade that came about due to the Crusades during and afterward, in which they enjoyed monopolies, and you had this period of time of peace and prosperity. And that peace and prosperity, this is where the great works of art come out of. And if I have some time here before I finish up, I'll maybe bring some examples along here. But the big change that the Renaissance brought about was in the way Western Europeans thought, their thought process in it. And it represented an evolution from scholasticism to humanism. And then this humanism led to the rise of science. So I'll begin here with the scholastic mode. And I know we've talked about this a little bit, but it's really an important sort of thing. It's a method of critical thought that were taught in the medieval universities. Now, this is an important development that for the first time since Rome, you actually have universities, places, centers of higher learning that had been in place in the Muslim world for a long time, and in China all the way back to the days of Confucius, or the Han Dynasty at least, and of course the monk teaching of the Buddhist and the Hinduist hermits who spent their lives reading and studying, etc. That was fine during the Greco-Roman period, but it went away during the Middle Ages and resurrected itself in the late Middle Ages with scholasticism. And the purpose of the scholastic scholar was to reinforce the beliefs of the Catholic Church and the traditional beliefs that existed in kind of a pseudo-scientific way. They weren't unscientific, they just weren't scientific. Now, you had breakthroughs, the development of the harness for the horse for plowing as opposed to the yoke for oxen, and other advances, the three-field system instead of the two-field system, medicine and so on were improving, but you just didn't have that great advancement forward. Scholasticism was, its goal was to preserve the status quo. It was a dialectical reasoning where you presented two opposite forces, they did battle, and you came to a synthesis. Now, this was already predetermined in advance, but you had to recognize that there were counter-arguments, but then the counter-arguments had to give in, concede that they had lost, and you get a little bit of a what would be called a dialectical materialism of a sort. The big thing was to reconcile faith and reason, because as the Middle Ages progressed, as the Renaissance started to evolve, the use of reason became more and more of an issue. It was the idea that if you reasoned too much, you were going beyond what God wanted you to know, and therefore it could undermine your faith. The guy that really tried to reconcile this was Thomas Aquinas. And his book was Summa Theologia. And basically it was a summary of Christian thought up to that point, and his point was that God had given you reason. Therefore, if you used reason and you didn't question your faith, it would lead you to a greater understanding of your faith. His was an attempt to reconcile faith and reason, but it also was an attempt to preserve the status quo while allowing for scientific inquiry. Now, the best example that I know of about this what is known as the Ptolemaic solar system. Ptolemy was a Macedonian, a Greek, who was part of the ruling family of Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest. And here's a simple version. I'll go with this one here. Here's a simple version of the Ptolemaic universe. There's the Earth, and here's the Moon. And they got that part right, that the Moon did go around the Earth. But then Mercury, Venus, the place of the Sun, then Mars, then Jupiter, then Saturn, all these went around the Earth. This is the geo or Earth-centered universe there, and they went to great lengths to prove and support this position. There's another image here I want to get to. This is one example of it. Again, this is just a beautiful rendering, clearly done in a monastery by a medieval monk here. It's that same system that I showed you. This is the grand, elaborate sort of thing, and it really showed the close link between scholasticism and the Catholic Church, and again, the preservation of tradition. And this ran square up against Renaissance humanism, which saw man as an entity of in its own valuable essence, the beginning of artists signing their work rather than not taking credit for it, etc. But the big thing for Renaissance humanism was empirical evidence. Okay? That sense experience is the knowledge or source of knowledge acquired by means of the senses, observation, experimentation. Okay, it's not terribly different in many respects than Confucianism, which again was a preserver of the traditional side of life, or even Taoism, which said go to nature and observe nature. Empirical evidence for these humanists was evidence that justifies a belief in the truth or falsity of a claim. In the empiricist view, one can claim to have knowledge only when one has a true belief based on empirical or observable evidence. Now, do they say you can't have faith, that you can't believe? No. But this is kind of the derivation of the term secular humanist. That is a pursuit of knowledge independent of church and faith beliefs. The reason is the basis on which you developed your arguments, and experimentation is what you went to. Now, this then led, and this was not formulated until, probably the 17th century, but it's what's called the scientific method, and you've all had this in your science classes in junior high and high school, etc. Is you make observations. What do I see in nature? Then you think of questions. Okay, what does this lead me to ask about? And then you formulate hypotheses. Now, what this led was a man named Copernicus to come to the concept, the idea of the helio or sun-centered universe or solar system, because as he looked through his telescope, the patterns that were put forth in those Ptolemaic circles and fine paintings and drawings, etc., didn't seem to match up with what he was able to observe. So he began to formulate hypotheses to explain some discrepancies. You develop some predictions, and then you test those predictions. And after you do that, you can refine, alter, expand, or even reject those hypotheses. The failure of a hypothesis does not represent failure. It represents the idea like, oops, that's not it. Let me go back and try again. Develop some theories, go back, make more observations, some questions, hypotheses, test, and so on. This is what we know as the scientific method, and it evolves completely independent of any religious, faith-based beliefs, etc. And they had to dance around this very carefully because it was the church that was supporting, in many cases, the scholastic beliefs and benefited hugely from that status quo. But this is really the big thing that came out of the Renaissance, was this idea that you didn't believe things on faith alone. You could have faith, you could have beliefs. Copernicus, Galileo, the great revolutionaries of astronomy, both were very religious men. But they chose in their secular observations to disagree with what the scholastic scholars had said was the truth. And this right here, the rise of science in the West, is really what begins to separate apart the West and its rise to prominence, in that there was not an acceptance of the status quo. There was, let's go out and check. Okay, you have this hypothesis. You think the world's flat? Well, I disagree. I think it's round. And I'm going to go out and check that out. Now, again, to be sure, there was desire for knowledge, etc., adventure, but the motivations became clearly economic as well. And the Renaissance was really not only a rebirth in arts and in learning and new thought, but it was also an economic revival. You don't have great artwork unless you have a period of peace and prosperity that came out of there. Now, one of the other driving forces came about late in the Renaissance. I think I better double back here a little bit. Okay, the Renaissance. This definition of the Renaissance goes from the 14th to the 17th century. In other words, from about 1350, maybe a little earlier, to about 1650. And it doesn't happen at the same time everywhere. It starts in Italy, spreads to France, and then from France it goes to Spain, to the Netherlands, from the Netherlands to England, and in England it culminates really with the writings of Shakespeare as probably the great end of the Renaissance as such. But since it's ideas, it's a system of ideas, it never does have any particular end. Now, one of the great driving forces you get to the computer here. I was talking about the computer and I forgot to put it on. Again, it's a period in European history from the 14th to the 17th century. It's the transition point between the old medieval Europe. They, in fact, were the ones that called the period that preceded them the Middle Ages, and what we call modern history, that is everything from the Renaissance onward. Interestingly, our own country, the United States, our entire history, for all intents and purposes, is in the modern era. Very young country in terms of that issue. But what I wanted to go to here is that one of the seemingly simple but very important developments of this particular period, and that is the development of the printing press. Now, here's this is a picture of the old Gutenberg printing press. Now, did Johann Gutenberg invent the printing press? No. We all know from our previous chapters here that the printing press was invented in China, used primarily to print money, but also broadsides, information, etc. The Gutenberg press was built with the express purpose of printing books, And it really was an undermining of the monopoly that the Catholic Church had on written material. Virtually, there was no prohibition against someone else writing materials. The problem was nobody else had the time. You had to earn a living, and you didn't have a time to do the laborious task of copying, a 1,000-page book by hand. So in effect, they had a monopoly on it. It was the development that here it calls it the late medieval society, but it's clearly to me within the Renaissance period. The printing press found its way from China to Europe, and this, of course, is the first book that Gutenberg printed on his printing press, and that is the Gutenberg Bible. There are a few of them still in existence. They're in rare books libraries scattered around the world. Falls into the category of priceless. You couldn't buy one if you wanted to. And so you have it there, but it was printed again completely in Latin. The big thing that Gutenberg's printing press did is it began the mass production of books. And here you see, all of a sudden, within 50 years, you've got printing presses in all parts of Europe. Notice most of them here in northern Italy, but you have some in Switzerland here, southern Germany, up here in the Netherlands, etc. So the printing press is just really, really a huge, important addition to the whole history of the world. The thing that it did is it led to increased literacy. As there were more books being printed, there were the ability of more people to learn how to read, and you get the beginning of a semi-public sort of education. Usually you would have to pay sometimes a small fee, but there was another interesting sidelight to this, is that you started for the first time to, and on a small scale, get the education of women. Now, there had been literate women during the Middle Ages, during the age of chivalry, etc., but that was the exception to the rule. But the presence of schools where people could learn how to read and to write really changed the game considerably. And that leads us to the next major point here, the Protestant Reformation. Now, this is an important term. Sometimes it's referred to just as the Reformation, but I think it's important to throw this in, that it was the Protestant Reformation. And the emphasis here in the early years was not on the sectarian nature, this is the root word here, protest. Okay, what you had was devout Catholics, okay, people who were staunch supporters of the church, but who wanted to reform it. Okay, that's why it's called the Reformation. Okay, to reform. Sometimes when you hear the term Reformation, you think of some kind of physical change, and there was some in a political sense, but the Protestant Reformation was one in trying to get the Catholic Church to reform itself. As we saw with the schism in the church, the Babylonian captivity period, the period where you had 3 popes, etc., the reputation and the hold of the church on the population suffered, to say the least. The image of its infallibility, etc., came into question. And also at the local level, the bishops in particular began to acquire more land, more authority, etc., and they claimed exemption from taxation. And this is an age-old problem. If you've got the majority of people paying tax on their property, and then you have this special group not paying tax, that group had better render some kind of special service where there's going to be problems. Well, as the church became had to have less of a hold on the thoughts of people, pressure started to come that, hey, why are you guys tax exempt? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And it all comes to a head in 1517. And this is the 95 Theses that Luther prints up. And now notice, here they are. Here are the 95 Theses that Luther posts on the door of the Cathedral of Wittenberg. Now, you probably can't read Latin, but I think you can see that it's written in Latin. That was that was the language of scholarship. It was the language of a church, and it was meant to be directed at the church. And his theses were his 95 positions. And of those, 95 is a lot. And they're largely criticisms of the practices of the Catholic Church that went on. Well, the church here in 1517, it's at a high point in terms of the Renaissance in Italy. It's when St. Peter's Cathedral is being built. It's when the great commissions of artwork, the Sistine Chapel, etc., all being done and all paid for by the church. And all of this takes money. And so there's a Catholic tradition called indulgences, where you can go to a priest and say, hey, maybe within the context of the sacrament of confession or not, and just say, hey, I've done some wrong things, and I really don't want to have to suffer the consequences in purgatory or hell. Can I have forgiveness? Can you indulge me? And the priest or the bishop would have the authority to grant these indulgences, but you would have to do something in return. Make a pilgrimage somewhere, say X amount of prayers or whatever, or you could make a monetary contribution to the church. Well, what happened in 1517, around that period, is the church needed to raise money, so they sent a monk out called Tetzel. And Tetzel was an excellent salesman. He's selling indulgences left and right around across Germany, sending money back to the papacy, etc., to great effect. But clearly, when you're selling indulgences, just outright selling them, vending them, who's going to be able to purchase their way into heaven? Well, of course, the wealthy. And the poor don't like this, but the new and emerging middle class, the people of the towns that were created by the increased trade of the Crusades and then the early Renaissance period, they're taking a look at this and going, we really don't like this sort of idea. And what Luther does is he includes in his 95 Theses his criticism here of the sale of indulgences, among other sorts of practices which he saw to be not of the proper way to do things. And here is a painting of one Martin Luther. He strongly disputed the claim that freedom from God's punishment for sin could be purchased with money, proposing an academic discussion of the practice and efficacy of indulgences in his 95 Theses. He refused to renounce these writings on the demand of the Pope in 1520, and this led to a series of actions that some were taken against him, some in terms of kind of settling him down. But Luther's other big theological position a very tortured soul, in the sense he always worried about whether he was going to be saved or not saved. And this period in world history, for some reason, there was just a widespread concern. As people became more literate and became more aware of things around them, the idea of salvation was one that troubled them. And Martin Luther said, you're not going to be saved by any amount of good works. That doesn't seem to work in my mind. You are saved by faith alone. And if you believe strongly enough, you will have salvation. And if you don't, you will not. Probably the extreme end of this, and I've only seen a couple films on this, up in the backwoods areas, the Appalachians, they have these same sort of justification by faith kind of evangelicals. And what they will literally do is, in their religious ceremonies, they will pick up a rattlesnake by the tail. They have them kind of in a confined area there and pick it up. Now, why did they do that? That seems like a crazy thing to do. Well, their belief is, if my faith is strong enough, the snake won't bite. And if I'm not, the snake's going to bite me and I'm going to be condemned anyway. This is the extreme kind of attitude of justification by faith. Luther didn't advocate handling snakes. I just use that as an example. He refused to renounce his writings upon the demand of Pope Leo X in 1520. And so the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, here's Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and his armor there, etc. And Luther, for Charles V, is kind of an annoying little sidelight. The Holy Roman Emperor, interestingly enough, was elected by a variety of different nobles who existed within that area called the Holy Roman Empire. And more often than not, they would elect a weak emperor so that they could do whatever they wanted. And they were kind of used to being on their own, even though they always had to acknowledge the power of the emperor. Well, they had some problems, the Holy Roman Empire did, with France and with the Turks, who had invaded all the way to Vienna and Austria. And so they elected this strong man, Charles V. But the trouble with him is he had to fight those two battles between the French and the Turks. And so he chose to follow a middle course, and they conducted the Diet of Worms, the Diet being a meeting at the city of Worms. And again, the papacy is demanding that Luther recant. And here's a fanciful painting of Luther defending himself. Now, this is kind of one of this picture is, they say, worth 1,000 words. Here's Luther dressed up very simply as a monk, and here you have the papal representatives in fine clothing, silks, etc., sitting in judgment here of the simply clad Luther. Now, the other thing that's interesting, notice the hearing here is, and this painting is not held in a cathedral, a big church, but this is a simple Protestant church. One of the things about the early Protestant churches was their rejection of all the pageantry and pomp and size of the Catholic churches. And here's Luther basically saying, I cannot recant. I cannot turn down what I absolutely believe, what God has revealed to me in that particular council. As a result, he is excommunicated in 1521 from the church. Now, normally, this would mean his execution. That once he's excommunicated, he's outside the church, he's a heretic, and he would be excommunicated there. What happened is, Charles, who needed the support of people who were supporting Luther, decides, okay, I'm going to let him leave before I decide to do with him, knowing full well that the people who supported him were going to stage a fake kidnapping and whisk him off to a castle where he was protected for the next couple of years. But what Luther did in the time, really all the way to the 1500s, the Bible, the Christian Bible, was available in Latin in the West, in Greek in the Byzantine Empire, or you could get it in Aramaic, the original Judaic language in which it was written. But what he did when he was in isolation in the castle, being protected from being executed, is he translated the Bible into German, into the vernacular. And once that happened, there was just a veritable explosion of religious thought and religious ideas, because once it was translated into German, then it went into French, then it went into English, then Danish, Swedish, etc., and you now had the Bible available. And now, this idea of educating females, because you needed to be able to read the Bible, was necessary for your salvation. You now had women going to school on a much larger scale than they ever had been before. Now, this was only true for the people in the towns, in the middle class, the newly emerging middle class in the towns, but it really led Protestantism to be spread like wildfire. And it's kind of an amazing sort of thing, this translation of the Bible into the vernacular, that is the language of the people, the lingua franca, whatever was spoken in a given language, and the spread of public education. And I'm going to really diverge here for a moment because I think it's interesting. It's a very strange law here. And they are referred to as the Old Deluder Satan Act. Let me get the computer on. Let me walk around and get the lights on again. So annoying. Ta-da! They're back on. Now this is the one, this is the Massachusetts General School Law of 1647. Now, the colony of Massachusetts was founded by staunch Protestants, and they believed that you needed to read the Bible. And here's a very interesting thing. The first public schools in America were set up with the specific purpose of teaching children how to read the Bible. But this is where it's interesting. It being the one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of scriptures, as in former times, by keeping them in an unknown tongue. So they are criticizing the Catholic practice of having the Bible in Latin so that only priests could interpret it. And then the rest of it says, so in order to be able to free yourself from those prejudices and ignorances, that you should learn how to read so that you could learn to read the Bible, and both males and females were educated to do so. This system really produced a very educated population in the Northeast. Girls went to the 6th grade, boys to the 8th grade, very seldom beyond that. But it's very interesting that they saw this translation of the Bible into English as their means of salvation. And two things that go hand in hand with the Protestant Reformation is the emergence of a broader educated public, more literacy, and the idea that you can use that knowledge to make money and move forward. And I'll talk more about that later. Okay, I guess I better get back here to the Protestant Reformation. So here you have Luther as the early advocate here of the Reformation. There's a couple things about this. Your text covers them fairly well, so I'm going to go right to that. Is the Diet of Worms basically reaffirms the church's position that they don't want to be reformed, but Luther escaping with the help of the nobility and writing the Bible, translating it into German, now basically creates a separate, quote-unquote, reform group. Okay, they do not set out, they do not have the idea, Luther certainly does not, of starting a separate religion. He wants to impose his belief, his will on the papacy in getting it to reform itself. And as it's printed, the Reformation spreads like wildfire via the new printing press, via Luther's translations, etc. The peasants' revolt comes out of this because as more people are reading the Scripture and challenging the authority of the church, they say, well, if we've got a sense of equality here within the church, we want some political equality. We want some reforms from the taxation and the serfdom, etc., that still exists, and we want to move forward and reform the political system as well. And Luther very emphatically says, no, that is not what I meant, and I do not support these peasants' revolts. This kind of then gives the blank check to the nobility, who go out and massacre the peasants by the thousands in kind of squelching that incipient revolt. But this is another thing, that once the church authority is challenged, you start to find here, there, and eventually everywhere questioning of not only church but also political authority, where you start to have the masses demanding some sort of a say in the government. Another area that is controversial about Luther is in his attitude toward Jews. He basically said that all Christians at first were Jews, and that eventually his position is that Jews should read the Bible, see the light, and become Christians. When that did not happen over the course of the next 20 years, Luther became a little bit, I won't say anti-Semitic, but a lot less tolerant of Jewish practices and beliefs. And it kind of falls in line with the anti-Semitism that had begun during the Crusades. Now, the next guy I want to go to Huldrych Zwingli. Okay. Once Luther had let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, with his translation into German, more and more people started reading the Bible, and as we all know, the Bible is subject to interpretation. This was one of the reasons why the Catholic Church always kept it in Latin, so that they were the sole interpreters. What happens very quickly is that the church doesn't accept Luther's reforms, and as a result, the people who believe the same way as he does become known as Lutherans. It's kind of a de facto sort of thing. But then there's another group that began with Zwingli that come to be known as Calvinists, and then you have Anabaptists, Baptists, Puritans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Congregationalists, etc. Very quickly, within 100, 150 years of Luther and his theses, you have literally dozens of different Protestant groups emerging with a belief set there. You got the Lutherans. Now, the Calvinists intentionally separated themselves from the church. Lutherans kind of were forced out by their excommunication. Another group here, very interesting, the Anabaptists. They were like the early day Amish, in that they rejected society as a whole and kind of withdrew. Not well liked really by almost anybody else. The Baptists were adult baptism. And so on. But what I want to focus on here are the Calvinists, because they become extremely important throughout what we're going to go through next. And as you know, in the European tradition, when you have extreme differences, you're going to end up with what you would call warfare. By 1523, Zwingli had gotten the entire city of Bern in Switzerland to convert to his particular point of view. And the Calvinists, of which Zwingli is considered part of, and he starts out firstly with the literal interpretation of the Bible. His position was, if it's not in the Bible and it's somebody else's interpretation, you don't have to do it. And this was mostly an attack on the Catholic Church, which over the course of the 1600 years of its existence had come up with a variety of interpretations to answer the problems presented by faith. And they were the sole authority, so went forward. But Zwingli was also, and is one of the Calvinists, he believed in predestination. That is, and it's a logical thing, that if God is all-knowing, what must God know? He must know who's going to heaven and who's not. So all this, it's a lot like Luther, the justification by faith, that unless God has come and told you that you're going to be saved, there's a good chance that you're probably not going to be saved. And this predestination concept, it runs rampant throughout the 16th and the 17th century, and is a huge, huge factor in the early settlement of the United States. Because the U.S., what became the United States, was settled as a Protestant country, unlike the rest of the Americas, South America, Central America, the western part of the United States, Mexico, even Quebec and France were settled as Catholic countries. And so this Calvinist interpretation and this concept of predestination really shapes a lot of American culture. You wouldn't think so just from looking at the beginnings of it, but history is a strange sort of thing. Now, this is how fine the line can get in it. And Zwingli and Luther, here was one of their differences. The Catholic Church had taught that at the consecration part of the Mass, the priest changes bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. That's called transubstantiation. Luther disagreed with that, and he said, no, it's consubstantiation. Now, I'm not going to ask you to know the difference between those two on any exam, but it just shows the fine hairs that as you get into religious dogma you can get into. What Luther said is no, it was never changed. God was always present in that bread and wine, and therefore there wasn't some magical transformation that took place. Well, Zwingli disagreed with Luther, and he said, it's not really there in any real physical sense of the word. It's there in spirit. It's there spiritually. So these three not very far apart beliefs about the Eucharist and communion, they argued, fought, and killed each other over for the next 100 years or so. And I just go through that one simple example, which I'm sure probably still isn't clear in your own minds. Just read that section in your book, in your text about it. Let me look at what page it's on here. It's on 430, 431 in your text. You might have to go over it a couple times to grasp that distinction. But people took these things very, very, very seriously. As I said, the Anabaptists here are not well liked. As I said, they were the Amish. They're the antecedents of what we call the Amish. And it's one reason the Amish are here, to escape persecution over there. It's kind of interesting. I was just looking at an article on one of the internet pages, and it had the 50 least educated counties in the United States. And in Ohio, Holmes County was number one. And it's because a lot of the Amish who live in Holmes County don't finish high school and don't go to college. And so therefore you have a lower educational level. And it ties in with that whole rejection of technology, electricity, and all of that sort of stuff. But it had its origins back here in the 1500s with the Anabaptists, who were persecuted for their belief system. About 5,000 of them were executed for their position on things. But the guy that's really significant here is John Calvin. And like Zwingli, he's set up in Switzerland, in the city of Geneva, which is on the border with France. Zwingli was in Bern. And the Swiss were able to preserve their independence because they were up in the mountains. They were very difficult to attack, and they didn't really have a lot of resources that anybody else wanted. So they were quasi-independent. But Calvin, who had studied Luther, who had studied Zwingli, came up with his own interpretation, and he was a firm predestination guy. And what he established in Geneva, what is called a theocracy. Okay? And a theocracy is what the early Massachusetts of the 1600s, really through the 1700s, could be considered a theocracy, in which the members of the church ruled the political community. Okay, that's a theocracy. But it is a step toward democracy as well, because these Protestant churches were ruled by the adult male members. So, number one, you had to be over 21. Number two, you had to be male. But number three, you had to have become a member of the church, of the Calvinist church, a member of that hierarchy. And how did you become a member of the church? You had to swear that God had come and spoken to you and told you that you were going to be saved. And so you developed this concept that it was a community of saints. Why were they a community of saints? God had told them they're all going to heaven. They are predestined for heaven. And if you weren't a member of the church and you hadn't been told you were saved, there's a good chance you weren't. But the irony here is it's an exclusive sort of thing in terms of everybody can't get in. But if you were in, notice the ruling of the city is done in a democratic manner. You elect officials, you elect your mayor, you elect your town council, etc. Now, is there a Bill of Rights? Is there religious protection? Absolutely not. One of Calvin's critics showed up in Geneva and started to question some of the teachings that he was putting forward. Calvin allowed a mob to seize him, put him on trial, and burned him at the stake. So it's not a freedom-loving place. It's a religion-loving kind of place, but ironically, it begins to evolve in a democratic way. Second of all, these were all middle-class merchants, most of them. Calvin, not so much. But they were in the business of prospering. They were the new middle class. They were the opposition to the old medieval nobility. They were literate. They were smart. They were worldly. They traveled, and so on. And so they moved forward. And one of the things they wanted to do was to become wealthy, to prosper, because again, prosperity was considered to be a sign of God's blessing, that God favored you. Not necessarily, but in all probability. And on the other hand, if you remained poor and didn't advance, well, just like if God hadn't come in and talked to you, there's a chance that maybe you weren't looked upon so favorably by God. So you get a big back and forth here during the Protestant Reformation within that time period. But it now becomes a political issue as well. Switzerland becomes more and more of an independent Calvinist entity, and the northern parts of Germany become more and more Lutheran, as do the Scandinavian countries. And of course, what that means is there's a possibility of conflict. So to protect themselves, the Protestants formed the Schmaldic League, and Charles V forms the Catholic League. And of course, they go to war. What happens in the war is that, quote unquote, Charles V wins. But as he tries to impose Catholicism on his newly conquered territories, because the Schmaldic League wasn't nearly as strong, didn't have as many resources, etc., he wins, but he realizes, I'm going to have to kill all these people because they aren't changing their minds just because I won the battle. So what you basically have in 1555, after winning, after quote-unquote winning, you get what is known as the Peace of Augsburg. It's a treaty that's signed, and basically Charles has to say, oh, well, I won, but I didn't really win much of anything. And what I have to do here is whatever religion the ruler of the 360 different principalities there are within the Holy Roman Empire, these people that get together and vote as to whether I get to be the Holy Roman Emperor or not. Now, once you're emperor, you're in. So it wasn't like he could be recalled or anything. But in order to retain their support, even after defeating them in battle, he was forced to recognize that, okay, if your ruler is Lutheran, you get to be Lutheran. And if you don't want to do that, then you are allowed to freely move without any penalty from that area to a Catholic area. And if you are a Catholic ruler, your members stay here as Catholics. If you are a Lutheran, you can leave and go to one of the Protestant areas. Not much of a way of religious toleration, but certainly a step in the direction of religious toleration. Notice who's left out. The Calvinists. That still remains an outlaw religion. Calvinism is not tolerated within the terms of the Peace of Augsburg there in 1555. And as you can imagine, this is going to cause a problem. Now, meanwhile, back at the ranch, you've got the Catholic Church. And you have the Counter-Reformation, or what the Catholic Church prefers to call it, the Catholic Reformation. They say, well, maybe Martin Luther had something. Maybe we need to reform ourselves. And they call the Council of Trent. And at the Council of Trent, they take into consideration some of the criticisms that the various Protestant groups had of Catholic Church practices, and they incorporated them into their belief system, etc. It took in some of the beliefs of Luther, but it was very, very rigid. They reformed themselves and they said, okay, we're still the authority. We're still in charge, and this is the way you have to believe. And what they came along with the Jesuits, led by Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius had been a soldier. He'd participated in various wars against Turks, a pretty good soldier, but he had had his leg blown off by a cannonball and went through some very painful rehab. You can kind of imagine what medicine was like in the 1500s. And while he's recovering, he has this grand religious experience, and what he proposes, and he finally gets the papacy to go along with it, is that he wants an army of scholars. He wants a very rigorously trained Jesuit priesthood, group of monks that are trained very, very diligently and into a high degree of sophistication, and they are to go out and counter the Reformation. They are to bring the Catholic reforms to the reformed areas, and quite frankly, they are pretty successful in doing so. Now, along with that, they do have some military forces that go along with them. And so this is not a pleasant sort of thing that happens peacefully and via the use of reason, though the Jesuits, they've founded colleges all over the world and really are the main missionary arm of the Catholic Church. In fact, for the current Pope is the first Jesuit who has been elected to the papacy, which caused some people some concern, but he seems to be a little more liberal of a theologian than Ignatius Loyola was in his application of things. So you've got kind of an unsteady sort of peace existing here. You've got here in Switzerland, you've got the Calvinists. Here in northern Germany, you've got the Lutherans. Here, you're largely Catholic. But then Protestantism finds its way to France. And before I get into that, and your text goes to France first. That's where I got a little confused. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the 30 Years' War, which kind of parallels, but is also apart from the French religious wars, and deal with that as well. The 30 Years' War. So again, the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation does undo some of the conversion to Protestantism and reconverts some Protestants to Roman Catholicism, and the Council of Trent does have some degree of reform to it. But it is not a complete sort of reform, particularly relative to the Calvinists, who are also a pariah to the Lutherans as well. What eventually happens is the frictions between not so much the Lutherans and the Catholics is the frictions between the Calvinists and everybody else. Now that's a long war, 30 Years' War. It's not as long as the 100 Years' War, but it is a long and brutal war. And it really sets Germany back. Now, this gives you an idea, and we're not going to go through all of these particular details that you see here. Here's all the people fighting. You've got the anti-Habsburgs, which is the Catholic side, and then the Habsburgs are, and then this is the Catholic side here, fighting one another. Here are the commanders and leaders. Nasty little business that went on. Okay, and again, this is not something that I'm going to go through in any detail. It's because hundreds of thousands, if not maybe millions of people died in this conflict. And they didn't die because of the military weaponry of the time. They died of plague and starvation. And basically you see it, you have the northern areas, Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, some of the Germanic states, Prussia, etc., down here, and they're attacking the Catholic part of the Holy Roman Empire. And Spain is also part of the Holy Roman Empire via the Charlemagne Treaty, and also here. So it's basically Northern Europe versus Southern Europe, and it goes on for a long, long period of time. It lasts from 1618 to 1648. It is ended by the Treaty of Westphalia. Okay, and the Treaty of Westphalia is kind of like the Peace of Augsburg a century earlier, kind of redux. It says the religion of the ruler is the religion that prevails within that area. You are free to leave if you are not of that particular religion, or to convert. And now it, for the first time, includes Calvinists, because Frederick III of Prussia became a Calvinist, and he also had the biggest, strongest army in the Holy Roman Empire, and other than the Holy Roman Emperor himself. And so he was able to enforce Calvinism within his areas. And Prussia, this is East Prussia here, this is West Prussia here, etc. And then in Austria, the Habsburgs were the Catholic bastion. And the Habsburgs were not only here in the Holy Roman Empire, they were in Spain, they were in Italy, they were in the Netherlands, and we're in the 1600s. They also have the largest empire in the world. Good portion of North America and all of Central and South America, and we'll get into that in one of the next lectures. The net effect, this 30 Years' War really devastated Germany, because ethnically, Austria and Germany are much the same, culturally much the same, but they had been politically divided since the days of the Treaty of Verdun, when Charlemagne's sons divided up his empire. And now you're going to throw in a mix of religious divisions. And unlike the coastal states, Germany never unites. Italy never does either, but it's more to do with the papacy than with these political divisions, because Italy remains staunchly Catholic throughout all of this process. But you add the political divisions and religious divisions. Germany doesn't develop as a nation state until 1870. Neither does Italy, and this is one of the causes of the First World War. But while they're fighting with each other, these states here on the periphery are making out like bandits, so to speak. Now, France doesn't come out of these religious wars unscathed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the French religious wars, and then I'll take a break. I don't know if I'll do another lecture today or not. But the French religious wars are just crazy. So I'll go to that. The French wars of religion are sometimes known as the Huguenot Wars. Okay, the Huguenots in France were the French Calvinists. Switzerland was right there on the border, Geneva, and there was a lot of influence of Calvinism within it. But it's not just a religious war. It ends up being a political battle as well, for a lot of different reasons. They're called Huguenots because the Calvinist leader, was a guy named Hughes. I can see I misspelled Huguenot up here. G-U-E-N-O-T. The Huguenot Wars. Put that up on the document camera so you can see it there. In these French religious wars, approximately 3 million people died. Again, not so much because of actual combat deaths, but again, plague, famine, etc. Because if you're fighting a war and you're not getting supplied from the outside, then you're not going to be able to feed yourself. The 30 Years' War took 8 million lives, so it kind of overshadowed the French wars that went on. But the French religious wars are sheltered kind of in between the religious wars that ended with the Peace of Augsburg and the religious wars that began with the 30 Years' War in 1618. One of the central figures in this is Catherine de' Medici. Now, when you see her name, what does that tell you? She's not French. She's Italian. She's from the wealthy Medici family in Florence. The French had come in and, as we know, conquered the Italian city-states, but they're still quite wealthy. And the king of France, decides he's going to have a political alliance with the city of Florence, and he marries Catherine de' Medici, who brings a good deal of wealth with her, along with the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa by Da Vinci is in France. It was purchased by Henry II, and it hangs in the Louvre today. So the beginning of these religious wars begins with the death of Catherine's husband. It's Henry II. Now, Henry II, whether he would have been a great or a strong enough leader or not remains to be seen. But In 1559, Henry II dies. Now, he doesn't die a natural death. He's in a jousting tournament, you know, like knights in armor with the lances, etc. Somebody, I'm not sure of the details of it all, but I don't think he fared too well when his lance gored the king and killed him in that. So Henry II dies, and he's got a son, Francis II, but he's only 10 years old. So, guess who's running the country? Catherine de' Medici. She's Italian, and a lot of the citizenry of France didn't particularly care for that. The situation that then occurred is Francis dies in 1560. Charles IX, the even younger son of Henry II, comes in, and Catherine is the queen again, the queen regent again. So you can see there's a good deal of political instability going on here in France. And this is the Valois dynasty. The de Medicis become the last of the Valois dynasty, and there's an attempt by three different groups to take over. The group that eventually wins, the Bourbons, who are Protestant, Calvinist, the Guise, who are intentionally Catholic, and then you have another group, the Champions, who are kind of neutral, but lean heavily toward the Protestant side. They're the more pragmatic of the three groups. They're all kind of circling the dying carcass of the Valois dynasty. And you're running into this situation, the same thing that you have perhaps happening in Germany, that the religious differences are going to split a nationally united entity, the Kingdom of France. And during these religious wars, it comes very, very close to do that. Catherine, as she takes a look at this, and she notices that 2/3 of the nobility is Protestant. And so she recognizes the Civil War probably isn't in her best interest. So she orders a degree of religious tolerance, that you can, outside of the major cities and not in the open, you can practice your Calvinist ideology. Very similar to what Elizabeth I did in the 1500s in England. She did much the same thing. You can be Calvinist Puritans, just don't challenge my authority. And Catherine pragmatically kind of saw this in this direction. But the Guise don't like this. So again, in 1562, you have some toleration. That is to occur. Some, I'll put up here, some. The Guises don't like this. And some of the Protestants are a little bit more overt than they like. And so they attack a group of these Huguenots and kill, several hundred of them. And now you have kind of an all-out civil war beginning. Catherine kind of gets some of the blame for this. And then there's an assassination that takes place of some of the Protestant leaders, who then turn and attack the Guises. Well, on August 24th, 1862, you get the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. in which thousands of French Protestants are annihilated as they are at church by the Catholic Guise forces. And it breaks out into a complete civil war. Catherine's kind of inept diplomacy is proven to be pretty much a non-entity. So what happens is she is deposed and Henry III. So she is the wife of one king of France and the mother of three different kings of France. And what emerges in France during this period of chaos are a group of people called the politiques, who say, we can't have this. We can't have this religious split, because if we split up into 3 or 4 different political entities, we're going to be much more vulnerable to attack by our lifelong enemies, the English, who had long craved land in France since the days of William the Conqueror, and even the new power on the block, the Spanish, who are filthy rich from their empire in the Americas. And so these guys say, we've got to figure out a solution. Well, Henry of Navarre enters the equation. And he's a practical guy. He is a Protestant. He is a Huguenot. But he forms an alliance with Henry III, partly because he's married to Henry III's sister. I'm not sure if she converted to Protestantism or not. Probably did. But they form an alliance against the Guises and begin to move and actively, now with a combined Catholic and Protestant force, get some degree of success militarily against the Guise forces. And then, unfortunately for Henry III, he's assassinated. They're moving forward. He's assassinated. A conference comes in with the politiques, and Henry of Navarre becomes Henry IV. So the Protestants won. Nope. Here's Henry IV. In order to become King of France, he has to agree to renounce Protestantism and become a Catholic. And when he's questioned about this by some of his followers, he says, Paris is worth a mass, meaning that the unification of France is more important to him than his exterior religious beliefs. And then he orders the Edict of Nantes. And in the Edict of Nantes, it's basically religious toleration in France. So, with the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, the Edict of Nantes, late 1500s, you have kind of a backdoor religious toleration taking place in Europe. Now, that's at the loss of 11 million lives. So if you wonder about modern day religious conflict, it's nothing new, and probably the loss of life in terms of that is probably a good deal more minimal than you might think. So I'm going to break it off here, and then I'll come back with a later lecture. Where I'm going to pick up is on the conflict between Spain and England as it evolves, and then I'm going to do a little backtracking on the history and evolution of England as well. So I'll wrap this up here and move on.